Good evening. Before we go into the text of the Torah portion of this week, I just wanted to mention that today is a special day, not because of the inauguration or Martin Luther King Day, but because today is the anniversary of the passing of one of the greatest Jewish leaders, known as Maimonides. He passed away in the year 1204. So we're talking about over 800 years ago. And he was known for many things, but he was the greatest scholar of the Torah. He was a great leader, great philosopher, a great physician. He was an astronomer. He knew everything. And he contributed to Jewish knowledge perhaps more than 99% of other people. So I just wanted to mention that today. That's a very significant day. And it's more significant in that it occurs around the time that we read in the weekly Torah portion about Moses. And Maimonides' name was Moses. And on his tombstone, they have inscribed, Mimoshe v'ad Moshe lo kam k'Moshe. From Moses to Moses, no one has arisen like Moses. So he's compared to Moses. Moses was the lawgiver. God gives the Torah through him. And Maimonides wrote an encyclopedic work on Jewish law, bringing together all of the sources of Jewish law in one work. It's a work that has 14 volumes. And each volume is divided into sub-volumes. So there is a total of 83 volumes to this work, this encyclopedic work. And he did it all single-handedly in the course of 10 years. And the fact that we're reading in the Torah about the first Moses, how God gives him the instructions to liberate the Jewish people from Egyptian bondage, and it occurs at the time that the second Maimonides, who also happened to have lived in Egypt, and he liberated the Jewish people, not physically, but he liberated them from false beliefs, from all sorts of heretical beliefs. He wrote a book called Guide for the Perplexed, where people who were influenced by Greek philosophy, Aristotelian philosophy, and who felt that was in conflict with Judaism, with religion. And in the Guide for the Perplexed, he shows how there's no contradiction between the secular philosophical teachings of Aristotle and Judaism. And in some places, he refutes Aristotle, shows that he's wrong, and the Torah is of course right. So it's providential that we read about the first Moses and the later Moses in the same time. The name of this Torah portion is Vaera. The word Vaera means, and I have appeared. And what is this about? At the end of last week's Torah portion, God sends Moses to Pharaoh to demand to let my people go. Actually, during the years when people were trying to help liberate Soviet Jewry, the slogan they use is, let my people go. But there's a little problem. That's not the end of the sentence. Let my people go so they may serve me. God is saying, I want to liberate them so they could become servants of God. Liberation in and of itself is not an end. It's a means to an end. People who celebrate, and we do celebrate freedom in this country, if freedom means license to do whatever you want, then that freedom is worthless. When does freedom have value? When it gives you the opportunity to do what's right, what's moral, what's godly, because then it's true freedom. And I just want to explain a little bit more what the definition of freedom is. There are many levels of freedom. If someone is in chains and the chains are removed, you could say they were freed. If someone was locked up in a prison and they're let out, you could say they were freed. But that's not the real definition of true freedom. True freedom is that you are able to live in a way that is consistent with who you really are. Just to give you an example, a little child will run across the street to catch a ball and there's traffic coming his way. And you're going to say, well, that's the child. Let him be free. He can do whatever he wants. Would you call that freedom? You wouldn't call that freedom. Why? Because that's not really what the child wants. The child doesn't know what it really wants because it's not old enough. So by you stopping the child from running into the street and restricting the child's freedom, you're really doing what the child really wants, because that's the true desire of the child. And the same thing is true with adults. What is our inner desire? It's to do the things that God wants us to do, to follow the commandments, to be moral. So when we free someone from prison and they come out of prison and they have no understanding of what's right and what's wrong, they're not free. In fact, you could be in prison and be more free than you are out of prison. If in prison you follow whatever you can do in prison, considering the restrictions that you have, and you do everything that's right and moral, and when you're out of prison, you go back to your criminal behavior, you're less free out of prison than you were in prison. So when Moses demands of Pharaoh, let my people go, he always adds, so they may celebrate with me, they may serve me. You're free to be able to be a person who follows God's commandments. So Moses goes to Pharaoh. This is all last week's Torah portion. He goes to Pharaoh and he makes the demand, and Pharaoh not only doesn't agree to let them go, he says, I'm going to make life even tougher for them. I'm going to force them to find the straw that they used to use for making bricks. In the olden days, they used to provide them with the straw, and they just had to make the bricks. Now you're going to have to find your own straw. And life became more difficult. The taskmasters were beating the Jewish officers who were in charge of producing the quota of bricks. And they complained to Moses, and Moses goes to God and says, God, you messed up. It's what you sent me for. You made things worse. Moses complains to God. So that's where the Torah portion, God says to him, Moses, don't worry. That's not the exact words he uses. He says that now you will see what I will do to Pharaoh, because with a mighty hand he will send them out, and with a mighty hand he'll drive them out of his land. So God says, look, wait a little. You'll see how everything will work out for the best. But meanwhile, Moses was arguing with God. He's complaining to God. So this week's Torah portion picks up with that. And God says to Moses, you know what? I used to have a relationship with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And I didn't reveal myself fully to them as I am to you. And the way it's understood is that God was rebuking Moses. God was telling Moses, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob didn't complain when I told them to do things that didn't make any sense. For example, God says to Abraham, you're going to have a child, and he's going to be the father of a nation. And he blesses him with a child called Isaac. And then God tells him to take your son, Isaac, and slaughter him, bring him as a sacrifice. Abraham could have said, God, one second, it doesn't make any sense. First you tell me I'm going to have a child who's going to be a father of a nation. Now you're telling me to kill him. It doesn't make any sense. Abraham doesn't question God. So God is saying to Moses, Moses, you should learn from the patriarchs not to question me. So the truth is that Moses didn't do what's wrong. What Moses did was the natural result of someone who was endowed with a mind. God gave us a brain, and God wants us to understand as much as we can possibly understand. Moses was the ultimate intellectual, and therefore when Moses sees something that doesn't make any sense, that's who he is. He's the one who asks questions. What do you expect of an intellectual if not to ask questions? But then God says to him, you know what? That's how you were until now. Now I want you to reach a higher level. There are two ways you can deviate from logic. One way is to be a fool, to go beneath the level of logic, to be an idiot, to not have any intelligence. But then there's another level where you go beyond your intelligence, you go beyond your intellect. God allows us to understand some of what he does, but ultimately he wants us to recognize that God is really beyond logic and beyond nature, and that Moses should have now reached a level where he doesn't ask questions. So his asking of the questions was not a bad thing, but God's saying, now I want you to be elevated to a higher level. And then God says to him that you should tell the Jewish people, I am God. And he goes through 4 different expressions. I shall take you out from under the burdens of Egypt. 1. I shall rescue you from their service. 2. I shall redeem you with an outstretched arm and with great judgments. 3. And then I shall take you to me for a people, and I shall be a God to you. You shall know that I am God, your God, who takes you out from under the burdens of Egypt. So there are 4 expressions of liberation here. When we celebrate Passover at the Seder, we drink 4 cups of wine. Why 4 cups of wine? So there are several reasons, but one of the reasons is that there are 4 expressions that God uses. God could have just said, I'm going to liberate you. No, he uses 4 different expressions. I shall take you out from the burdens of Egypt. I shall rescue you, shall redeem you. I shall take you to me. So because of these 4 expressions, we drink 4 cups of wine. But that just begs another question. Why 4 expressions? Is that an excuse to drink 4 cups of wine? Not necessarily, but there are 4 different levels of liberation. There are 4 different things that they had to go through. The Jews in Egypt were slaves. Now, a slave can mean 2 things. It can mean that you don't have freedom, you belong to someone, but it could also mean you're tortured. Not every slave in history was subjected to torture. There were slave owners who were very nice to their slaves, but they were still slaves. So the first thing that happened was that the Egyptians stopped torturing the Jewish slaves. That happened 6 months before the Exodus on Rosh Hashanah. Rosh Hashanah is 6 months before Passover, a little more than 6 months before Passover, 6.5 months. And that's when the slavery, the torture, slavery ceased. That was the first relief. And that's consistent with what it says here. I shall take you out from under the burdens of Egypt. The burdens, the heavy burdens that they had to carry, that they were subjected to, that was removed a half year before the Exodus itself, as a result of the 10 plagues, which we'll talk about soon. That's the first thing. But then they were still slaves. They were still slaves. They didn't have freedom. Maybe not tortured. They were no longer forced to do labor, but they were still not free. So that was the next step of liberation. They were redeemed from the state of servitude, no longer slaves. But they were still prisoners in the land of Egypt. They couldn't leave the country, and then they were liberated from Egypt. Like the Jews in the Soviet Union were not slaves, but they were prisoners for many decades. They couldn't leave Russia. But then, so that's 3. Why is there a 4th one? The 4th one took place 7 weeks after the Exodus, when they got the Torah at Mount Sinai. Because the Torah was what really freed them. Because as I said before, freedom without responsibility, freedom without morality, freedom without following God's commandments is not really freedom. You're not free physically until you're free spiritually as well. So the 4th level was when God took them to him as a nation. They were no longer followers of a pagan way of life that they were subjected to in Egypt. They were now God's servants. So those are the 4 different stages of liberation. Then we're skipping over a lot, because if we do every verse over here, we'll be here for a few years. Then God says to Moses to threaten Pharaoh with the 10 plagues. The first plague, we're going to go through a few of the plagues. The first plague was that the Nile River turned into blood. The second plague was that the river produced frogs. That's how some commentators translate the word svardeia, frogs. Some translate it as crocodiles, a little bit more frightening than frogs. But either way, the Nile produced these frogs. Those are the first 2 plagues. So I'm going to analyze those first 2 plagues. Well, first of all, before we even analyze that, what was the purpose of having 10 plagues? If you're God, you can do anything. So God could have forced Pharaoh to let them go with 1 plague. God could have made a plague that would be so intense that Pharaoh would have said, okay, I'm letting them go. So obviously the 10 plagues were not geared to get Pharaoh to let them go. Not only that, but God hardened Pharaoh's heart. When Pharaoh was already prepared to let them go, he couldn't do it. God hardened his heart. So if God is hardening his heart, that means God was making him incapable of liberating the Jews. What was the purpose of the plagues? So the purpose of the plagues was twofold. But the twofold is really one. The first point is it was a punishment. For all these decades and centuries of slavery, they deserve to be punished. The second point is, and it's connected to the first point, God doesn't punish people for the sake of punishment. The Torah does not want you to punish people just to hurt them, to make them feel pain because they did something wrong. Punishment ultimately is intended to teach them lessons and thereby cleanse them and remove the stain of the sin from them. That's what punishment is all about. So when God is punishing the Egyptians, He's educating them. What is He educating them about? Number one, He's educating that there is a God. Number two, that God is in control. Number three, that God has a special relationship with the Jewish people that were in Egypt. These are the three objectives of the plagues, that we have to recognize there's a God, and within that there's a God, there's one God, because the Egyptians also believed in gods, and many gods. So every one of the plagues was actually an educational device, not just a punishment. So what was the device of the blood, of the water of the Nile turning into blood? The Nile River was worshipped by the Egyptians because their whole economy depended on the Nile. It doesn't rain in Egypt. So all of their crops are irrigated by the Nile River. If the Nile River doesn't have the power to produce any vegetation, it's useless. So the first thing that God did is not just to create a nuisance, that their water turned into blood and they couldn't drink water. It was a nuisance, obviously, but it was not the worst thing in the world. It only lasted a week. The purpose was to show them, your Nile that you worship is futile. It has no power. It doesn't have any power of its own. So that was the first plague. So what was the second plague? Again, the Nile was struck, and the frogs or the crocodiles came out of the Nile. What's the difference between the first plague and the second plague? Both plagues afflicted or affected the Nile, which was their god. So perhaps the difference is there were two ways of discrediting and destroying a false belief. One way is intellectually, and the other way is emotionally. Intellectually is the Nile River produced all their sustenance. When you see the Nile River turning into blood, what does that tell you? that it's illogical to worship the Nile, because the Nile is not going to be able to produce all the crops. So the first plague was intended to get them to understand that the Nile River is not God. But when you're emotionally attached to something, just because you understand that it's wrong, it's not going to make you abandon it. People are attached to false beliefs. They know it's false intellectually. You could prove to them and they can't argue. And yet, they'll be attached to it because they have an emotional attachment. So the second plague, which, especially if it's to produce the frogs, well, it can apply to crocodiles also. It's just revolting. It's disgusting. It's abominable. The way it's described, how the frogs not only came out of the Nile, but they spread throughout the whole country into people's ovens. You opened your mouth, a frog jumped in. And if it was a crocodile, it was even more frightening. It really destroyed their emotional attachment to their god, the Nile River. Then the third plague is lice, where the earth turned into lice. That's a pretty big nuisance. And this is the first time that Pharaoh's magicians, whatever names you can call them, his wise men, his philosophers, his magicians, couldn't replicate that. The first two plagues they could replicate. The magicians turned water into blood. They turned water into produced frogs. So they were not impressed with the miraculous nature of the plagues. The third plague, they said, this is God's finger. This we couldn't do. We couldn't replicate turning the earth into lice. Why not? So I'm not too familiar with magic, but our sages tell us that magicians, in order for them to do things, the object that they work with has to be larger than a kernel of barley, which is pretty small. But lice came from the sand, which is even smaller, so they couldn't replicate that. So they realized that the Jewish God was more powerful than their magic, than their magical powers. But I think there's also a moral lesson in this. This told them something about God that many people today don't recognize. Most people, when you bring to their attention the things that God wants us to do, the commandments in the Torah, and a lot of people ask the question, why does God care about what I do? The universe is so great, and God created the whole universe. Does he care what a human being, not even a speck of dust on the earth, does? Why would God care? God is so big, why would he care about something so small? When you think about how one human being and one action of a human being is nothing compared to all humanity, nothing compared to the earth, nothing compared to the solar system, nothing compared to the Milky Way, nothing compared to the whole universe. The numbers are astronomical that we can't even grasp how little we are. And yet God wants me to do this action or that action, as if God really cares. I mean, why would God, who's so big, care about little things? And that's the problem with anyone who asks that question, that theologically they just reduce God to a relative greatness. God is great because he's so big, because God is so great. That makes him great, and that he can't look at something small. For God, the whole universe and one speck of dust are equal. Because when you're dealing with something that's infinite, true infinity, there is nothing that has any value. $1 trillion and a penny, $1 trillion and a penny are equal to someone who has infinite power. So for God, nothing big is big, and nothing small is too small. Everything, if God wants, everything has infinite value. If God wants me to take a penny and give it. Nowadays, a penny can't get you anything, but if we'll pick on a quarter. God wants me to give a quarter to a homeless person to buy something, and you'll say, what's the big deal? It's one act of kindness in a universe so vast, it's meaningless. No, that has infinite value. Why? Because it's connected to the God who was infinite. When God who was infinite tells you to do something, that thing is now acquires an infinite character. So the whole universe is nothing compared to one act of kindness. One mitzvah that we do has more value, infinitely more value, than the whole universe. Why? Because it's a godly action. Where did we get that notion that small is not small? We get it from the third plague, that God says, I could connect to small. You can't. You're too big for small things. So big is just as small is limited, so is big limited. God is unlimited, and when He tells you to do something small, it becomes unlimited. It acquires an infinite character. There are a lot of stories that illustrate the point of how one little action can have infinite value. We had this a few weeks ago when the Torah told the story of Joseph. Joseph is sold by his brothers, unfairly, of course. Then he's accused of committing a crime, and he's thrown into a dungeon. And in this dungeon, he notices two people, the baker of the king and the butler, are depressed. And Joseph asks them, why are you depressed? Now, why would Joseph care? Joseph had every reason to be upset about being in prison unfairly. So he didn't really have to care about those two people who were not his friends. But Joseph did an act of kindness, a mere gesture. And what do? They tell him their dreams. And he interprets the dreams. 2 years later, Pharaoh has an ominous dream, two dreams, where the fat cows were swallowed up by the lean cows, and they remain lean, and the fat stalks are swallowed up by the lean stalks. And nobody could interpret those dreams. And Joseph comes and says there's going to be 7 years of plenty, followed by 7 years of terrible famine, in which you'll forget that there were 7 years of plenty. And he gave Pharaoh the advice to store food in the 7 years of plenty, and that saved the world from starvation. Where did that all begin? With one act of kindness, by asking these two ministers of the king, why are you depressed today? And he had every reason and every justification to ignore their plight, but he didn't. Look at that, it saved the whole world. One action, the Talmud says, Maimonides codifies this, that a person should never underestimate the value of one mitzvah. A person should look at as if the whole world is evenly balanced between good and evil. And if you have a scale where you have both sides are equal, even a feather will tip the scales. So that's another point, that not only is something small really infinite if it's God's commandment, but it has the power to tip the scales and bring salvation to the whole world. That's what the third plague teaches us, that small is not small. There's a story that happened with the Rebbe. The Rebbe is the greatest Jewish leader who would get letters every day, more than the President of the United States. People would write to him for his blessings, for his advice. There were some days he would get hundreds of letters. It was a regular thing. He would get hundreds of letters every day. Sometimes he would get about 1,000 letters in a day. And his secretaries would not read his mail. He would open up his own envelopes. And most of the mail was people writing about bad things happening to them, their illnesses, their lack of money, their lack of health. Every imaginable problem, people would write to him. And good news was very limited. People didn't write the good news. They wrote the bad news. And there was a point in time when the Rebbe was like very I can't use the word depressed, but he was down because he was really burdened by all the terrible news that he was getting on a daily basis. So his aides tried to cheer him up, and they started telling him, your followers just built a huge synagogue, they built a huge school, they did so many great things. It didn't help. Until one day he got a letter from a child in Detroit, Michigan. I heard the name of the child, but I don't remember it. The child writes to the Rebbe that he would go to school in a school bus and he would say his prayers in the school bus, but it's very noisy in a school bus and it would be distracting. So he made a resolution to wake up 10 minutes earlier and say his prayers before he went on the school bus. And he wrote to the Rebbe to tell the Rebbe about this. And that cheered the Rebbe. And the Rebbe wrote him a letter saying, you can't imagine how much you revived me. Your letter to me was like cold water on a weary soul. Now, they told the Rebbe about big things, big accomplishments. He was not impressed. But when a child made a little gesture of making an effort to be more godly for 10 minutes earlier than every day in the past, that was something that had infinite value. That had some tremendous value. That's the third plague. Then we get to the fourth plague. The fourth plague is called Arov, which literally means a mixture. A mixture. There are different interpretations what it means, but the most accepted one is there was a mixture of wild animals that rampaged through Egypt. Lions, tigers, bears, and all the wild animals. And it terrified the people. But the Torah makes a very strong point. It did not enter the areas where the Jewish people were located. Now, it doesn't say that about the first three plagues. It doesn't say that the Jews had water that didn't turn into blood. Some say it affected everyone, but it doesn't. Even if it didn't, it doesn't mention it. It doesn't mention that the frogs didn't affect the Jewish areas. About the lice, it doesn't say that. The first time it says that is about the mixture of wild animals, because here, the first three plagues, God was demonstrating that He is more powerful than the Nile, that He's the true God, and that God values small things, that He's a God that is not deterred by the smallness of something. So it told them something about the nature of God. Now that they know a little bit about God, God is trying to show them that I have a special relationship with the, as they would call then, the Ivrim, the Hebrews. The Jewish people have different names. Originally they would call the Hebrews Ivrim. And God was saying, I have a special relationship with them. I'm going to show you that they're different. That the plagues that affect the Egyptians are not affecting them. Because the Egyptian could have said, you know what, this is a natural phenomenon. You know, there are people today, they call themselves scientists, who say that all the plagues were all natural. They give all sorts of natural explanations for all the plagues. They don't realize that the fact that all these natural events happened in sequence to hurt the Egyptians and not the Jews, that itself was the great miracle. Even if the other things were not necessarily miraculous, which they were. But the Egyptians could have argued, you know what, this was a natural phenomenon. Every now and then, water turns into blood. Every now and then, there's a great accumulation of frogs. Lice exist, you know, it happens. So God was trying to show them that, yes, you think it's a natural phenomenon, then why doesn't it happen for everyone? When a natural phenomenon only occurs to one group of people, and every member of that group is affected, and every other member of the other group, none of them are affected, that tells you that there's a purpose in this plague, that it's not just a coincidence, it's not just a natural phenomenon. The next plague was dever, pestilence, a plague that affected the animals. The way this continued was, until this point, God doesn't say anyone died. We don't know if anyone actually died as a result of the first 4 plagues, because the water turned into blood, but they didn't die of thirst because it says in the Torah that if they dug new wells, they had water. It was just a big nuisance. The frogs are frightening, they're disgusting. Crocodiles are a little bit more than disgusting, but it doesn't say that anyone was actually died, nor does it say that their property was destroyed. The lice didn't kill anybody and didn't destroy their property. The wild animals frightened them, but it doesn't say that the wild animals actually killed anyone. The first plague that actually caused destruction was the plague of dever, of pestilence, where their animals died. Their livestock died. God was saying, until now I was just playing with you, frightening you, alerting you to reality. But now it's going to start hurting your property. Because in Judaism, your property is an extension of yourself. Why is it forbidden to steal? Why is it forbidden to steal? Well, it's obvious. It's immoral. Yes, it is immoral, but there's something deeper than that. When God put us in this world, He put a soul in a body. What's the purpose of the soul in the body? The soul's purpose is to refine the body. But God also gave us resources. He gave us a house, an apartment. He gave us a car, whatever property we have. Because He wants us to bring refinement to even our property, to use our property for the right things, for positive things, not for negative things. So your property is an extension of yourself. And when your property is destroyed, it's a sign that God is giving you a message. I wish the people in Los Angeles would be listening to this. Anytime it happens to anyone, it's sad, and we feel terrible about it, but everyone should introspect, and when something like that happens, that you have a loss of property, maybe God's giving you it doesn't mean you're a bad person, but God is trying to tell you, you're not doing enough to make your life a more godly life. But He doesn't start off by hurting the body of the person. He starts off first with the property. But the next plague was boils. God is already starting up with the people's physical existence. This was even more harsh than any of the other plagues, because now it's afflicting their physical bodies. And the next plague, which is the last one, the 7th one, the last one in this week's Torah portion, the other 3 are next week, but the last one is hail. This hail was hail with fire. It killed people who were outside were killed. It killed livestock that didn't die in the other plague. And it destroyed crops, which would produce hunger and famine. So this one was the most difficult thus far, because it actually physically afflicted people, not just afflicted their bodies, but actually had the effect of killing some people and continuing to wreak havoc on their property as well. So this is how the plague goes. God is going in increments. And then next week, we read about the last 3 plagues, which were the most harsh of all the plagues. Just to give you a complete picture, the 8th plague was locusts that devoured all the crops, whatever was left over from the hail. Then there was the plague of darkness, and then the plague of the firstborn. So we'll discuss this, God willing, next week.